Hi, we come to the end of 1 Kings 4 and the end of our unit here, as the narrator gives us his incredible summary of Solomon's great wisdom. You can see on the right side of the screen it forms this little ABA chiasm to end the story, with the first part about his name spreading around the nations and the return part about people coming from all the nations to hear that wisdom. So as we look at this, one of the things we're going to be looking at, as we've seen, is where it fits in our story here. We've been following chapter 4, which began with the list of his officers, including one in charge of the forced labor, and the 12 who were charged with providing food from the locals to provide for the royal house. And then we saw the summary of his dominion and how much it actually cost the entire nation, or if we think of it as a nation or a collection of tax districts, to provide for him. And now we get to the summary of his wisdom. And as you can see on the right side, it says God here and not Yahweh. And when we look at our chapter, Yahweh and God are not mentioned anywhere else in this entire chapter. If we hadn't known this was in the midst of something we call the Bible, it would seem like a purely secular description of a royal reign, and here God is mentioned. And the question we need to ask is, the fact that this is Elohim matter rather than being Yahweh? Elohim is a generic word for God, and it's actually plural for gods, but it uses a plural of majesty to refer to Yahweh God, as often is. It's often translated as Lord God in Bibles. But is there some sense it's a generic gift here rather than the specific gift of the covenant partner of Israel? Because we see nothing about the people here. This is all about Solomon and him being greater than everybody around. And one has to ask a number of questions about that, even though the only question I have on my list of questions here is why the comparison with foreign nations. And that has something to do with what I'm about to ask right now. But the issue is, did Israel want to have a king so they can brag that their king is smarter or wiser? Is wisdom the same as intelligence? Is a separate question. But is it the comparison of his wisdom and we're proud of our king really what they wanted, at the expense of some of them engaging in forced labor and having to give the food that they've raised with much difficulty and challenge to the king so he can eat off, as we'll hear later, gold plates? Is that what this is all about? So we focus on just the greatness of Solomon. He's certainly described as great here. And if you look on the internet about this passage, it's nothing but praise. It takes it all at face value. But my job is to not take it at face value, but to get myself and you to consider, is this really what Yahweh is intending for the relationship between the people and their king? And there are a number of hints in here, as I've been suggesting, that say even on the terms of 1 Kings, not bringing in Deuteronomy 17 as it did last time, or Genesis as we will a little bit today, or Exodus as we'll also touch on today and bring in more later. Apart from later texts that seem plainly, or at least implicitly, critical of Solomon, perhaps this, which is also meant to be the praise of Solomon, also has an implicit criticism as well. So we'll have to look at that as we go. So let's put the shape back up and we'll look closely at our situation. We see how many times Chokmah for wisdom. You can see in my note below 6 times in this immediate passage. I was noting in the previous video, the Hebrew numbering and the English numbering diverge here. So it's a little bit of a challenge that what you see on the screen is chapter 4, 19 to 34. In the Hebrew is 5, 9 to 14. Chokmah will be clustered again in chapter 10 around the Queen of Sheba coming, but we won't see the word Chokmah anywhere again after 1141 for any king other than Solomon. Even Josiah, who I've been noting in 2 Kings 23 is described as the greatest king of all time, none before or after were as great as him. In the Torah, it's very common in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but not in Genesis, Numbers, or Leviticus, which is very interesting because a number of other words we've seen are common in Numbers and Leviticus, but not the other way around. In Exodus, as we'll see, Chokmah applies not to wisdom in the way we're seeing it described for Solomon, but another aspect, which is skill. We might call that practical wisdom. And it'll also be held communally, although there'll be a couple of individual people whose technical skill will be raised up as well, and we'll look at that as we go. So that's one of the issues here. Is wisdom meant to be collected in the person as an expression of what exactly? The greatness of the nation because they have a great king, or collectively in the people as a whole? Let's look at the 3-part gift of what's described here. God gave Solomon Chokmah here, and one issue is, does the word great, me'od, here apply to all 3 collectively or just wisdom? It probably doesn't make much difference in our interpretation. So Chokmah, wisdom, discernment here, tebunah, only Deuteronomy 32:28 and the Deuteronomistic history, and there negatively, as you can see here, they are a nation void of sense. There is no understanding in them. And then breadth of understanding, or literally breadth of heart, as vast as the sand of the seashore, which is very strange. Because we noted previously, sand to the seashore is almost always used for large numbers of people. We saw it in Genesis 22, but also in Genesis 32 for the people so large they can't be counted. And so here describing something that's not numerical like sand is a curious element. Is it meant to contrast something that's simply clustered inside Solomon versus all the people? Perhaps so. So breadth of heart, what that is supposed to mean, though, heart, again, in the Hebrew scripture context, does not mean feeling or empathy, but of decision, a place of decision-making. So it's consistent with discernment and wisdom in that sense that he's been given the authority to make good decisions and to know what's going on. But we don't hear anything about any decisions. We hear nothing about his leading the nation at all, but simply showing off. And in the first couple of verses, we don't even hear that. It's just spoken generically as if wisdom was just like wealth, something you know what it is and you can compare quantities of it. But how do you compare quantities of wisdom? How would they have done that then? What would be evidence for someone's wisdom being greater than somebody else? And again, that's not just pure intelligence. Normally, we distinguish in many other cultural contexts, distinguish wisdom, which is something like knowing the right thing to do, versus intelligence, just being able to perceive things, but not necessarily knowing what the right thing to do is with what you know. So we don't hear intelligence here, but that certainly raises the question of his wisdom. So it's described as surpass the people of the East, or literally the sons of Kedem, or of the East here. It presumes an international reputation for the Eastern wisdom, not otherwise known in the text. But certainly in a later period, when the Persian Empire and the Babylonian empires were powerful, they were certainly known for great wisdom, and the Babylonians gave us wisdom that we still carry, like geometry, or like in their base 60 number system, the 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, or 360 degrees in a circle. So some of that can be looked at directly. The Babylonians had all kinds of practical wisdom, astronomy, geometry, etc. But that's from a time after the time of Solomon, depending upon when we think the story was written, although most think it's not from the time of exile. Even if it's from the 8th century time of Hezekiah, that would be when Assyria was rising, but not yet Babylon or Persia. But specifically mentioned here is the wisdom of Egypt. And that's a very interesting thing, I think, that no other national wisdoms are mentioned, and Egypt plainly isn't to the east here. When you look at the atlas, in case you're not sure, well, here's our land here, and here's the east, here's the Euphrates, where we saw last time Solomon's sovereignty went up here to Tifsah. But Egypt, of course, is to the south and to the west from a perspective of Israel, so that's certainly not wisdom of the east. What would the wisdom of Egypt be? As Coogan notes below, the impact of Egyptian wisdom on Israel is especially pointed in Proverbs, where an entire literary unit, 22:17 to 23:11, exhibits close affinity to the instruction of Amenemope from Egypt. And we won't try to compare the Egyptian text with the Proverbs text. Proverbs almost certainly from a later time, but understood traditionally as authored by Solomon, connected with verse 32 that you can see on the left side. He composed 3,000 Proverbs. So why the wisdom of Egypt? Is that meant to remind us that Egypt is in the background of the whole story, as we saw in the beginning of chapter 3, with him becoming son-in-law to Pharaoh? We'll have to wait a little longer to know a little more about what the role of Egypt is here. And then he's compared with a number of individuals, none of whom we know elsewhere other than in brief mentions. But let's look at that, and then there's an interesting contemporary element. So wiser, making the comparison, or literally wiser than all humanity, ha-adam here, or some suggest amending it to the Edomites, but why the Edomites isn't clear. So wiser than all humanity, and this group of people, apparently all children of one person, but none of these other names are known. Only Ethan and Heman have any references that we can get from beyond this context. So we can see Ethan the Ezraite. In one definition, it means ever-flowing streams, although there's others. But in the preamble to Psalm 89, which in the New RSV, it doesn't have it, it's listed as verse 0, a maskil, which means a proverb, of Ethan the Ezraite. And at Ezraite, we see in the previous Psalm 88, a psalm of the sons of Korah to the choir master, according to Mahalath Lenath, a maskil of Heman the Ezraite. So Heman right here and Ethan right there. So there is some understanding in the Psalms, which came first is hard to answer, on whether the Psalm references are taken from here or not, or whether there really were these historical people that had written a Psalm or had at least had something to do with the Psalms that Solomon is wiser than? Is it just quantity? That they authored each supposedly one proverb or one psalm, and he authored more? Does that make someone wiser because they can do more things? Usually wisdom isn't measured that way, but perhaps it's exactly in an imperial context what's at issue here. And these other names are just simply unknown. First Chronicles tries to connect them all and make them all Israelites, but there's no evidence of who they are or of who Mahal is. And so presumably the audience knew that, and that's one of the elements where I'd suggest that the text is from the time of Solomon. What's the point of making up a bunch of names at a later time that nobody in the audience would have any idea who they are? I suppose it has some verisimilitude, but it seems out of the way to bother to do that, but you can decide for yourself. His fame, literally his name, spread throughout all the surrounding nations. And let's look at a comparison with Genesis, because the people who start to bring things down and lead to the flood, the Nephilim here, are described as warriors of renown, or literally men of the name, warriors of the name, Gibor, of the name. So these are people who are famous names, and that's exactly when Yahweh says there's wickedness on the earth. Most scholars would see those Nephilim and as fitting with the Watchers in the book of Enoch as people who are connected with eventually what's known as the devil or Satan, or rebellious angels that we hear in the story of Enoch, trying to bring a certain kind of wisdom down to people to rival God. The book of Kings doesn't know anything about Enoch, which is much later, but perhaps that sense of comparison of human names, human fame versus God's fame is what's at issue here. So there's an interesting contrast here in verse 31 and 34, both which have nations in the ORSV, but have different language. Here it has goyim, which is the standard word by which Israelites or modern-day Jews refer to others. The goyim, translated via Latin as Gentiles, but in the Septuagint it comes out ethnoi as simply nations. But here it's a little different. People came from all the nations is over-translating what we see. If we look at just the people, we hear it's literally, and came all the people, not from nations. So here, the surrounding nations certainly doesn't imply nations in the sense that we think of nation states with boundaries and kings. It just means the people who aren't us, non-Israelites and Judahites. And this is continuing in that theme. And that's part of the chiastic shape that I showed right here that we can see. So then we hear, just as we saw in the last little chiasm, the summary at the center of what it cost the people to provide for Solomon, now we hear what he produces with all the food. He doesn't go to war. There's apparently peace at the time. Later he'll build buildings. But right now, he's a writer. Literally, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. This is the first years of Mashal in the Deuteronomistic history, other than in Deuteronomy 28:37, which you can see here. Negatively, you become an object of horror of a proverb, so something spoken of negatively there. And songs, or literally Shirav here, only judges in the Deuteronomistic history elsewhere, numbering 1,005. That's what scholars have used, or historians traditional historians, to link Solomon with the Song of Song, sometimes called the Song of Solomon. But there's no evidence that he wrote that. It's certainly from a much later time period. So the three books that he's associated with biblically, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, are certainly all from a much later post-exilic period, but because of passages like this associated with him. The songs which you hear nothing about. And notice how that it connects both him and David with having this literary poetic character. David as a psalmist and Solomon as a writer of songs and proverbs. So again, is this speaking something great about the people of Israel? Aren't we proud of our king because he can do so many things? Makes him sort of like a Judahite, Thomas Jefferson. But is that what people like Thomas Jefferson for? Because he knew a lot about horticulture and wine and things, or because of what he did to help the country become independent of Britain? In other words, to act like a nation builder rather than a smart guy with plenty of free time on his land. And that's what we hear. He speaks of trees, from the cedars in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. There's no need to have details from that, but pretty soon in the next chapter, he's going to have Hiram cut down those cedars to build a house. So it's not like he's reveling in nature here. And then there's an interesting phrase. He would speak of animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. And that phrase together is repeated a number of times in Genesis, and we see it here in 126. God says, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, and the wild animals, and every creeping thing." In other words, God is the maker of those things and gives humanity collectively dominion over them. Solomon isn't having dominion over them. He's not eating them. He's just talking about them. He knows things about them. But is there an implicit contrast here, at least from the Genesis perspective, between creating animals, birds, reptiles, and fish and simply seeing them and talking about them? And you can make that judgment for yourself. Certainly at the time of 1 Kings, they didn't have Genesis, but Genesis certainly knew about Solomon, and we already saw that in the Garden of Eden story around the knowledge of good and evil. And so our little chiasm comes to a close here when people came from all the nations, or as I just said, people came from all around to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And we'll see that more specifically with the Queen of Sheba in chapter 10. But as my note has here, there's an interesting parallel with Isaiah 60, especially Isaiah 63 here. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together, they come to you. This is speaking of Jerusalem, including those who come from Sheba. They bring gold and frankincense like the Queen of Sheba. But here they're coming because Yahweh's light, as we can look up and see here, Yahweh's light is shining and filling the darkness. And that's why they'll come. They'll come to the light of Yahweh, not to marvel at the human wisdom of the king, but to the place where God is experienced as alive and present. So that's a definite contrast that we can see there. And Isaiah's from a later time, but we certainly know about this well. So they came from all the kings of the earth, and certainly that's an exaggeration. It will become negative at the end when we get to the end of the Solomon story, though. And there, our story shifts immediately to the building project. And so we'll look where that goes next time. See you then. Bye-bye.